All right. Well, welcome back to the YouTube. My name is Grant, and I am answering another question that a lot of people have when it comes to Christianity. One of the most common criticisms that are raised against the Christian belief system is the question of what happens to those who never hear the gospel. What happens to those who have never heard the gospel and they die? And I'll put the problem kind of in a few simple terms. And sometimes it's called the problem of the destiny of the unevangelized. And there's few beliefs that Christians have that lead to this problem. And the one is the New Testament teaches that salvation is found in Jesus alone, that there's salvation in no other name, but it's salvation in Jesus. And then Jesus, right as he is about to ascend into heaven after he completes his, work of redemption and dying on the cross, and the resurrection occurs, and then he ascends to heaven. Before then he gives a universal evangelistic charge to his disciples, where he says, "Go make disciples of all nations." Where it's not just for a few, but it's for everybody. But the problem is though that this kind of creates a little dilemma, because if salvation is in Jesus alone, and even in spite of the best zeal and passion for evangelism, there's still going to be many people that are going to die before they hear the gospel preached. And so, what happens to those individuals? Are they just automatically condemned to hell because they never had the opportunity? Can they possibly go to heaven? What's the solution? And I'm going to give you a few answers that Christians have given down through the centuries. And I'm not really going to try to pick one or the other, but here's a few options. One of the positions is known as restrictivism, and this is very commonly held. And it is the view that those who never hear about Christ will go to hell. And those who hold this position really emphasize the passages in the New Testament where it's the exclusivity of Jesus. Jesus says, John 14:6, very familiar, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And so what a restrictivist might say is, if a person could wind up in heaven apart from faith in Christ, then there are really two paths to salvation. You can believe in Jesus, or maybe you could be saved by your ignorance. Maybe you say because you never heard of Jesus. And they also point a lot to the early church, where the early church, they weren't banking on, well, maybe these people will get to heaven, spend eternity with God. No, they said no. People needed to consciously embrace the work of Jesus if they expected to be rescued from their sins. Another perspective is post mortem evangelization. And this is the start of a couple of views I'm going to mention, where really it seems like restrictivism, even though they're strong on the passages about exclusivity, it seems to be at odds with the biblical declaration that God, 1 Timothy 2:4, Paul says, God desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. And so those that reject restrictivism say it's a little too harsh. They highlight these passages. How can God's universal desire for the salvation of all people, how can that be realized? And one way creative, I think it is, a little misguided, is that those who didn't hear about Christ during their earthly journey will have an opportunity after death to accept or reject him. It needs to be said, those who embrace post-mortem evangelization, they do believe in a concept of hell. And so they do believe that people who reject Christ in eternity will spend eternity in hell. They just think that those who didn't get the opportunity on this life will get it in the next. And this is one of the passages that's heavily emphasized is a couple verses in First Peter that are notoriously difficult to interpret. But I think this is misguided, because the Bible seems to suggest that when a person dies, their eternal destiny is sealed. That kind of finalizes their destiny for or against the Lord. Another perspective that kind of taps into the universal desire of God for the salvation of all people is known as inclusivism. And what inclusivism suggests is that without the work of Jesus on the cross for sinners, nobody would be saved. Absolutely nobody. That the death of Christ is objectively necessary. What inclusivism suggests, though, is that conscious knowledge of Christ and his death is not necessary for salvation. And one of the main arguments for this position is consider the perspective of the Old Testament saints. The Old Testament saints did not know what Jesus did for the salvation of the world, and yet the Old Testament saints are saved. They have a right relationship with God based upon the future work of Jesus on the cross. But the point is, they didn't have conscious knowledge of that, and so inclusivists will kind of point that out and say that unreached people, those that haven't heard the gospel, are in a similar position, that God has revealed himself to all people through creation and through our conscience, and that an unreached person maybe could cry out to God in faith for mercy, and that God would apply the merits of the cross of Christ on their behalf and would consequently spare them from eternal punishment in hell. And I think there's a lot of Christians that hold this position that don't necessarily would call themselves that, but they think intuitively that there would be something unjust in God. God would be unjust if he would send somebody to hell for eternity just because of where the country they were born in. And so I think this position is quite attractive because it does show that Christ's death was necessary, and it leads to evangelization because these people, we're not saying they're definitely going to heaven, but there is a possibility that a person who is unreached might see Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Romans 1 talks about creation, that people are without excuse because of the handiwork that God has given, and that a person that is unreached by the gospel might cry out to God and God would extend mercy based upon what Jesus did for their sins. Final perspective I'm going to mention is what I'm just calling an agnostic perspective. And what that is because of the challenges that are associated with this question, because there's, God's universal desire for the salvation of all, exclusivity in Christ, it is impossible to know with certainty the fate of the unreached. And Christians can rest assured, Abraham asked this rhetorically in Genesis 18. He says, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" That at the end of the day, there's not going to be anybody that will be able to say, God did unjustly, that God was unfair. Nobody's going to be able to say that God is going to do absolutely right. And so, even though we might not be able to reach a conscious decision, with certainty on what position we hold on this question, we know that God's going to do right. And at the end of the day, everything's going to be right. But in the meantime, what this perspective would hold is, instead of, debating this theological question, Christians should busy themselves with fulfilling the Great Commission. That's the last words that Jesus left before he ascended, and that's what we should busy ourselves. So instead of worrying about the people in Africa that might have an opportunity, or the people in Indonesia or wherever it might be, well, I do know that if they hear the gospel and they believe, they will be saved, and that we can know with certainty. And so, Christians, I think this is a good challenge at the end. Even if we embrace some of the other perspectives like inclusivism, we need to make sure that we busy ourselves with the Great Commission and try to make disciples of all nations. So I've tried to help you here, hopefully today, with a couple of answers to this question. So God bless you. Have a great day.